A roar echoed down the entrance tunnel from the surface. Something was in the sheep pens. Can we not have a day of peace? Thought Licot, now known as Queasy to her comrades after that fateful kobold incursion had exposed the weakness of her stomach. If it was up to her, she'd have lain down the spear then and there, but it wasn't, and like it or not, she was good with the damn thing. The rest were already assembling at the foot of the ramp, preparing to meet it, whatever it was. There were lots of creatures which could threaten a fortress, everything from wilderness titans to wandering demons, night creatures, cave dragons at the head of a goblin raiding party, whatever bizarre creatures the elves have trained for war. The civilians took shelter in the tavern, and there was silence. Nothing came clattering down the ramp. No force of darkness or foul beast, nothing. Queasy could feel the sweat pooling under her armour. Despite herself, her arms were shaking. After a very long minute or so, the order was given, and they started making their way up the ramp to investigate. Something was up there. As they approached the surface, a stench grew. Not the normal stench of the sheep pens, but the metallic one of blood. Sure enough, whatever it was had ripped apart at least a couple of the sheep. It was hard to tell how many exactly. Most of them had made a run for it into the forest. Queasy kept her sick down, barely. She wasn't a fan of sheep. They smelled, and their wool made for frankly horrible clothing, but this just was not right. They followed a trail of blood out into the forest. The sunlight was dizzying. None of them had been outside for months. There wasn't any need to. To Queasy's left, Rakust puked. The trail led them in the direction of the river, until at the dismembered carcass of a ram they found a woman. A small, human, naked woman. She was conscious but clearly dazed and drenched in blood. She watched the dwarves approach, not fleeing, but poised to. "Werebeast," one of them muttered, and that was enough. Rakust, the closest to the woman, thrust his spear at her. She dodged it, but not quite well enough, and it caught her in the leg. Now she bolted. Humans always were better runners. It must be their legs. Their strides are longer, so they're faster, and they can go for longer. Even with her wound, the dwarves, with their own sun sickness, struggled to keep up. Queasy did her best, but the woman beat them to the river and leapt in, and that was that. Dwarves didn't swim. Even without a suit of armour, they didn't swim. So the dwarves stood and watched her paddle away across the water, hoping she'd drown. She made it to the other side and kept running. Queasy wondered if she'd even noticed that they'd stopped chasing her, and then she was gone. "She'll be back," Rakust muttered. "There's no getting away from beasts like that. Should have killed her when we had the chance." "Thief!" The cry went up. At first it was one dwarf, then another, then suddenly it was everyone. Rakust had taken Usithutir, many songs' treasure, and darted for the exit. He hadn't made it. Someone yanked the lever for the drawbridge, and with a mechanical groan the entrance above was sealed. The Baron seized Rakust and dragged him out of the tavern, leaving the earring where it fell. "Explain yourself," the Baron said flatly. "I speak!" Rakust was a spear dwarf, a respected one at that. He'd settled in Questring a few years after its founding, and had never put a toe out of line. For Armok's sake, he'd come in with Queasy. He continued to stammer. The Baron continued to stare him down. "It would be very easy for me to make sure you never leave this room, Rak, and you won't if you don't speak." "The goblin," he managed to blurt out. "Daigle, he offered me wealth if I helped him take it." The composure that you would want in a spear dwarf was utterly absent from Rakust. He was almost in tears. "Is he here, this Daigle?" "Yes." The Baron stood. "You shall be dealt with later. Go." The audacity to try and steal something so closely watched by so many dwarves, or the stupidity. The Baron knew Rakust. He wasn't a stupid dwarf by any means, maybe not the brightest, but he was a good soldier, and he was certainly old enough to have known better. Ordinarily, he'd have discounted the attempts to shirk responsibility as simply that, but there was clearly something to them. The goblin, Daigle, would need to be seen to. The guards grabbed him. It was straightforward enough. Goblins were a rare sight in Weatherspoons, tolerated, but rare, and he was brought in for questioning. Daigle, I believe. The goblin simply nodded. I believe we've had the pleasure of your visitation before, haven't we? I'm sure I recall sharing a mug of wine with your good self. Silence. You see, I've brought you here in connection with this ghastly theft business. I'm sure you noticed the commotion. One of our quite trusted spear dwarves has implicated you as some sort of, he took a moment to give a performative chuckle, criminal mastermind. Ridiculous, I know, but we have to investigate these things, don't we? Of course. You wouldn't happen to know anything about this whole ordeal, would you? You've not had a disagreement with this dwarf at all? I've never spoken to him. The Baron nodded. Of course. I'm sorry to have troubled you. I hope this doesn't reflect too poorly on our humble settlement. You know how we dwarves are. The goblin nodded. Let's return to the tavern. The Baron guided him out of his office and back into Weatherspoons, where the festivities were more or less back to normal. The earring was back in its rightful place. Happily, Tobal, the hammer, was present. Hammer! This is our auspicious guest, Daigle. Please make sure he's treated with the utmost hospitality. The message was simple. Rakust, now spineless, was beaten, as is appropriate for his crimes, and thrown in the dungeon for a month. The murmured consensus was that, frankly, that was more than he should have hoped for. Weatherspoons was running well. The occasional theft, attempted or actual, or disobedient crafts dwarf was no real bother. As far as the Baron was concerned, everything was going just as intended. Bards and dancers and poets and travellers passed through every day, sharing their stories and their arts, even if some of them were a little bit unorthodox, such as a certain unclad dwarf. There had been no sign of the frog for a long time now, and many songs was beginning to relax. Perhaps it had died somewhere out there in the wild, one could only hope. Even the presence of one traveller who proudly referred to herself as a thief didn't rustle very many feathers. Sigun was an elderly dwarf who made no secret of her shady past. She'd been born many years ago in Alstakwood and spent an indeterminate number of years bound to the will of a nearby group of goblins. She had, naturally, left all that behind her in the years since. She held with her a curious axe, an axe which drew rather more questions than her baby-snatching and pillaging past. It fascinated many of the revellers at Weatherspoons. Battle axes were a known quantity, but not ones of such beauty. Green tourmaline sat encrusted in the head, and bands of bismuth bronze and bone ringed the handle. Most indulgent of all were the studs of aluminium. It had been forged over 200 years ago in a fortress known as Lenshaw. Lenshaw. It was one of those fortresses which all dwarves hear of early in life. It had been born, spent 30 glorious years at the forefront of dwarfdom, mining such treasures as aluminium, only to dig too deeply and fall in one red day. It had wound its way through the ages since, being lost in battle and reclaimed over and over until it was retrieved by a close friend of Sigun named Ushrir, who kindly offered it to her before heading off to fight his final battles as a mercenary. His life was taken by an elephant. The way she told it, it was likely a romantic offering. In the 8 or so decades since, it came with her on her travels. It was a pleasant story, a hallowed artifact lost in the epic fall of one of the most legendary fortresses, eventually retrieved and offered to a potential lover. To the Baron, however, who had listened very intently indeed. It was more than a story. There were treasures out there in the world to be claimed and reclaimed. Thank you very much for watching. I do really feel like I'm starting to get into the flow of things in terms of how I want to produce these videos. My workflow, for lack of a better term, is really coming together. Big question mark for myself at the moment is the narration, which isn't something I'm particularly happy with how I do it, but it's also something which is quite difficult to change. I'm not a voice actor or anything, as I'm sure you can tell. So far, I have managed to stick pretty closely to a vaguely weekly schedule. That was not deliberate. It's just sort of how things have turned out. But for the next episode at least, and potentially for the next few, as we go into the end of the month now, the final gasps, the dying gasps of the academic year, I've got a lot of coursework to do. And I am also on a creative writing course, which means that it's not so easy to compartmentalize. I feel like I need to preserve my sort of creative energy for my projects. It's not just a matter of time, it's also keeping some water in the well, so to speak. But I've got some ideas. I feel like I've got a decent grasp of where I want to take things and how I can take them there. I'm even started to think of conclusions potentially in the longer term, so we have a nice narrative arc. Thank you very much for sticking with me. I do appreciate, obviously, you've heard the YouTuber spiel, all the engagement, hit like, comment, subscribe, ring the notification bell, all that. You've heard it before, but it does mean a lot. Obviously, from an algorithmic perspective, that's always appreciated. But let's be real, the main thing is that I'm making these videos because I want to make them, but also it's a lot easier to make them if you know that other people are enjoying them as well. So just from a purely personal perspective, I really appreciate comments, likes, everything, anything you can do to feed back to me and let me know, hey, you know, we're here, we're enjoying this. Thank you 1,000 times. That's all from me then. I shall see you in the next one, whenever it turns up. I can't promise anything at the moment.